In 1858, a man looked at his newborn son and understood that the child could ruin him. Edward Robinson did not smile when the nurse placed the infant into his arms. He did not step closer to his wife or soften in the way people expected. Instead, he stood still, holding the child just long enough to see what others could not. Then his eyes shifted, not to Margaret, to the clock on the wall, where time moved forward without hesitation, indifferent to what it was about to expose. And in that quiet moment, something inside him changed. Edward remembered the exact date he had left London, the cold morning when the carriage wheels cut through the damp street and disappeared into fog. He remembered the return just as clearly, every detail fixed in his mind with the discipline of a man who trusted facts more than feelings. Now, standing there with the child in his hands, he was no longer a husband. He was calculating. Margaret watched him from the bed, her expression composed but too careful to be natural. She had expected distance, even restraint, because Edward had never been a man of easy warmth. But what she saw now was something else entirely, something colder and far more precise. Not hesitation, not confusion, control. The nurse shifted her weight slightly, sensing that something was wrong without understanding what it was. The room, filled only moments ago with quiet celebration, seemed to narrow around them as if the air itself had tightened. Edward finally handed the child back. The movement was exact, neither gentle nor harsh, but deliberate in a way that felt final. It was the gesture of a man returning something that did not belong to him, even if no one else in the room yet understood why. That was the moment Margaret felt it. Not certainty, but the beginning of something she would not be able to stop. Because Edward Robinson did not confront. He examined. And once he began examining something, he did not stop until it was resolved. That evening, the house fell into an unnatural silence. Servants spoke in lowered voices, as if instinct warned them to stay out of sight, while doors closed with care and footsteps softened along the corridors. Nothing visible had changed, yet everything felt different. Edward sat alone in his study, the dim light of a single candle stretching shadows across the desk. In front of him lay a blank sheet of paper, untouched but waiting, like a question that had already been asked. He picked up the pen, slowly, without hesitation. The first date appeared on the page, the day he had left. He paused only long enough to let the ink settle before writing the second, the day he had returned. For a moment he said nothing, did nothing, simply stared at the space between those 2 points in time. It was not an empty space to him. It was a structure, a boundary, something that could be measured and tested. And within that space there was no place for the child. The realization did not arrive with force. It settled into him, quiet and absolute, like a conclusion that had been waiting to be seen. Edward leaned back slightly, closing his eyes for the briefest moment, not in pain, but in acknowledgement. When he opened them again, there was no trace of doubt left in his expression. No anger, no shock, only clarity. Because for him, this was no longer about betrayal in the emotional sense. It was a problem, and problems, when defined correctly, could be solved. Margaret did not sleep that night. She lay beside him, still and listening, trying to measure his breathing as if it could reveal what he was thinking. At some point, she realized that the rhythm had not changed at all, and that was what frightened her most. He was calm, and calm meant he had already begun. The next morning unfolded with unsettling normality. Edward spoke politely, ate breakfast at the same hour, and left the house as he always did, his routine untouched by what had taken root beneath it. But something had changed. He was watching. Not openly, not in a way that could be accused or resisted, but carefully, with a level of attention that turned ordinary moments into something heavier. He observed Margaret as she spoke, noting the brief pauses that appeared where there had once been ease, the way her gaze shifted when his lingered a second too long. He watched how she held the child, not for affection, for tension, because fear has a rhythm, and Edward Robinson had begun to recognize it. In that recognition, something settled into place. If there was fear, there was something to uncover, and if there was something to uncover, it could be proven. Edward did not live with uncertainty. He removed it. The investigation had already begun, though no one had named it yet. Margaret felt it in the spaces between words, in the way silence no longer felt neutral but carried weight. Every room in the house seemed to hold that pressure, invisible but undeniable, growing with each passing hour. The child slept peacefully, untouched by any of it, his breathing steady and unaware. But his existence had already become something more than life. It had become a question. And in Victorian England, questions like that did not remain unanswered. They destroyed everything around them until only the answer remained. Edward did not confront her. He chose something far more effective. He began to prove it. The first letter he opened was one he had already read months earlier, back when it carried no weight and no suspicion. At the time, it had been nothing more than another piece of polite correspondence, one of many that passed through the house without consequence. Now it was different. Now it was evidence. He placed it flat on the desk and let his eyes settle on the date. Not rushing, not searching, simply allowing the detail to take its place in a larger structure he was beginning to build. Then he reached for another letter and another, moving through them with quiet precision. It was not what Margaret had written that mattered. It was when. Edward began aligning the dates in his mind, mapping them against his own movements, his absences, the distances that separated him from the house during those weeks. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, a pattern began to form. Not obvious at first glance, but impossible to ignore once seen. There were gaps, short periods where her letters stopped without explanation, breaks in a rhythm that had always been consistent. Margaret wrote often, almost habitually, her correspondence steady and predictable in a way that reflected the order of their lives. Except during certain days, days that now demanded attention. Edward marked them quietly, not with visible notes but with memory, each absence becoming a point in a growing structure. When he finally reached the end of the stack, he did not look satisfied. He looked certain. From there, he turned his attention outward, not to accuse but to observe. The servants, as always, became a source of information without ever realizing it. Edward did not question them directly because direct questions create resistance. Instead, he listened. A maid mentioned a visitor once, her tone casual, almost dismissive, as if the detail held no importance. Edward gave no reaction, not even a glance that might suggest interest. But the information settled into place alongside the others. A carriage seen outside the house at an unusual hour. A gentleman received in the drawing room while Margaret was said to be resting. A stay that lasted longer than expected. Individually, each detail meant nothing. Together, they began to align. There was a name, mentioned only once, spoken in passing and quickly forgotten by the one who said it. Edward did not repeat it. He did not question it. He simply remembered. Later, alone, he wrote it down. Not because it proved anything, because it fit. But names, he understood, were secondary. The real structure of the case would not depend on identity. It would depend on something far more difficult to argue against: time. Edward arranged his own movements with the same care he had applied to Margaret's letters, reconstructing his absence with exactness. The dates were clear, supported by travel records, professional engagements, and correspondence that placed him miles away when the critical moment must have occurred. There was no flexibility in those facts, no interpretation, only distance. Still, Edward did not allow himself to rely on assumption, even when the conclusion seemed obvious. He required something stronger, something that would hold not just in his mind, but in a court of law where every detail would be tested. That was when he visited the physician. The conversation was controlled from the beginning, framed carefully to avoid revealing its true purpose. Edward presented it as a matter of general curiosity, a theoretical question about the limits of human biology. A man absent for a defined period. A child born within a certain time frame. Could it be his? The physician hesitated, not out of ignorance but out of caution, aware that answers to such questions carried implications beyond medicine. He spoke slowly, choosing each word with care, outlining the natural variation that exists in gestation, while avoiding any absolute statements. But even within that caution, the direction was clear. Possible in the broadest sense. Unlikely in reality. Edward did not press further. He did not need to, because certainty was not required. What he needed was something else entirely. Improbability. Improbability strong enough to dismantle legitimacy. When he left, he carried no visible reaction with him, no sign that anything had changed. But internally, the structure had shifted from suspicion to confidence. Margaret felt it before she understood it. The way he looked at her had changed, not dramatically, but enough that the difference could not be ignored. There was no longer a search in his gaze, no lingering uncertainty. There was conclusion. And conclusion brought with it something far more dangerous than doubt: action. Her response was instinctive. She began writing more. Longer letters, more detailed, more deliberate in their tone, as if control could be restored through careful language. Every sentence was measured, every word selected with intention. Yet the effort itself created something unnatural, because ease cannot be forced. And Edward saw it immediately. He read the letters not for their meaning, but for their strain, for the places where explanation appeared without necessity, where detail replaced simplicity. Those were the moments that mattered, not because they revealed truth directly, but because they revealed pressure. And pressure reveals weakness. That was when Edward changed his approach completely. He stopped searching for proof of betrayal and began constructing proof of impossibility. The difference was subtle, but decisive. Betrayal invites denial. Impossibility leaves nothing to defend. Within days, the formal notice was prepared, written with the same precision that defined everything Edward did. It was not emotional, not accusatory in tone, but exact, outlining the claim in terms that could be tested and proven. Margaret received it in silence. She read it once, her eyes moving steadily across the page, then again, slower this time, as if the meaning might change if she allowed enough time for it. When she finally lowered the paper, her expression remained controlled, but something beneath it had shifted, because she understood what this meant. The question was no longer contained within the walls of the house. It had been moved into the court. And once a question enters the court, it does not return as a question. It returns as a verdict. The courtroom in London filled long before the hearing began, not with urgency but with anticipation. People did not come because they were required to be there. They came because they had already heard enough to form an opinion and now wanted to see whether it would be confirmed. Margaret entered first, her posture controlled, her expression carefully composed in a way that suggested strength without inviting attention. Each step was measured, neither hurried nor hesitant, as if the rhythm itself could protect her from what was waiting. Edward was already seated. Everything about him reflected preparation, from the alignment of documents on the table to the stillness of his hands, which rested without tension, without movement. He did not look at Margaret when she entered, not out of avoidance, but because in his mind, the nature of their relationship had already changed. She was no longer his wife. She was the opposing side. The proceedings began without drama, unfolding in a sequence so orderly that it almost felt detached from the consequences it carried. Edward's argument did not rely on accusation or emotion, but on structure, presented piece by piece in a way that allowed each element to settle before the next was introduced. Dates, absence, distance. Each point connected to the next, forming something that did not require interpretation because it could be followed logically from beginning to end. The effect was not immediate, not overwhelming, but gradual, building with a quiet certainty that was difficult to resist. Margaret listened without interruption. Her composure held, barely, because while his words remained controlled, their direction was unmistakable, and with each detail, the space available to her grew smaller. She did not react outwardly, understanding that any visible response would become part of the case itself. Then the physician was called. The shift in the room was subtle but undeniable, as attention sharpened and conversations ceased entirely. This was no longer a matter of behavior or interpretation. It was something closer to fact, something that carried the authority of knowledge rather than opinion. The testimony was careful, almost restrained, as if the physician were aware of the weight his words might carry. He explained the general principles, the natural variations that could exist, the limits of certainty in matters of biology. But within that caution, there was direction. The timeline did not support the claim. Margaret held her position. Her defense moved toward uncertainty, toward the idea that human biology could not be reduced to exact calculation, that there were exceptions, rare but possible, that might allow for a different interpretation. For a moment, it created space. Not much, but enough to be felt. Because doubt, even in small amounts, can weaken a structure that appears solid. Edward did not challenge her directly. He allowed the space to exist. Then he removed it. The letters were introduced one by one, not as emotional artifacts, but as elements within the timeline he had already constructed. Each date aligned with absence, each gap reinforcing the pattern he had established, until the sequence became difficult to separate from the conclusion. Margaret's attention did not shift. Her expression remained steady, but inside something had begun to tighten. Then came a single letter. It was not longer than the others, not written differently. At first glance, it appeared ordinary, another piece of correspondence that would pass without consequence. Until it was read, a reference to a visit, a detail placed casually within the text, as if it held no importance, yet fixed to a date that did not belong to Edward's presence. For a fraction of a second, Margaret's control slipped, not visibly to everyone, but enough. Her hand tightened against the fabric of her dress, the movement small but precise, as if her body had responded before her mind could intervene. It lasted no more than a moment, yet within that moment, something irreversible occurred. The room felt it. The judge noticed, and Edward, without looking at her, understood that the final piece had settled into place. Because in a courtroom, words are not the only form of evidence. Reaction speaks, and sometimes it speaks louder than anything that can be said. From that point forward, the outcome no longer depended on argument. The structure had been completed, each element supporting the next, in a way that left no visible weakness. Margaret continued to speak when required, her voice controlled, her reasoning consistent. But the space she occupied had already been defined by what had happened. Not what she had said, what she had revealed. The final moments of the hearing unfolded with a quiet inevitability, as if everyone present understood that the conclusion had already been reached, even if it had not yet been spoken aloud. The judge reviewed the details, considered the arguments, and allowed the process to complete itself without interruption. When he finally spoke, his tone carried no emotion, only the weight of decision. But the truth had already entered the room long before that moment. It had arrived in silence, and it had remained there, undeniable. The verdict did not arrive as a shock. It settled into the room with a quiet finality, as if it had been present long before it was spoken. No one moved immediately, not because they were surprised, but because they understood that something irreversible had just been made official. The child was not legitimate, not Edward's, not his heir. The words themselves were measured, almost restrained, yet their effect was absolute. They did not need force. They carried consequence within them. Margaret remained standing, for a moment too long. Her body held its position as if waiting for something to change, as if the reality in front of her might still shift if she refused to move. But nothing changed, and that stillness began to feel exposed rather than controlled. Then she stepped back, not dramatically, not weakly, just enough to acknowledge what had already happened. The courtroom did not erupt, it breathed. Soft sounds moved through the space, whispers that formed and disappeared almost instantly, restrained but persistent. People did not need to speak loudly to communicate what they were thinking. They had come to see a question answered. Now they had it. Outside, the shift was immediate. Margaret crossed the threshold of the court and felt the world respond in ways that required no explanation. Conversations paused when she passed, not abruptly, but with a hesitation that was impossible to ignore. Eyes followed her for a second longer than before, then turned away as if contact itself had become inappropriate. A woman who had entered with a name, left with a reputation, and that reputation did not belong to her anymore. It belonged to the story. Within days, the changes became visible. Invitations stopped, not gradually, not with polite delay, but with a precision that mirrored the decision itself. Letters that would once have arrived without thought simply did not come, and the silence they left behind carried more meaning than any refusal. People who had known her for years adjusted quickly, not out of cruelty, out of instinct, because association had weight, and no one wanted to carry what had just been placed upon her. Edward moved differently through the same world, not loudly, not with triumph, but with a steadiness that signaled resolution. He had not raised his voice, had not displayed anger, had not sought sympathy. He had done something far more effective. He had proven, and proof in this society did not damage a man. It defined him. Margaret returned to the house for a short time, though it no longer felt like a place she belonged. The rooms remained the same, the objects unchanged, yet the space itself had shifted in a way that could not be reversed. Servants moved around her carefully, their behavior respectful but distant, as if they were uncertain which version of her they were now expected to acknowledge. No one spoke openly, yet everything in their posture suggested that they understood what had happened. She had become something else, not a mistress of the house, a consequence. She walked through the rooms without stopping, her attention drifting over familiar details that no longer responded to her presence. Each step felt like a quiet separation, a gradual release from a life that had already been taken from her. The child remained, unaware, untouched in the way only someone too young to understand can be. But even without understanding, he had already been defined, because from that moment on, he was no longer simply a child within a family. He was the result of a decision, and decisions, once made publicly, do not change. Margaret left without creating a scene. There were no tears, no raised voices, no attempt to hold on to something that had already been removed. The absence of reaction was not strength. It was recognition. There was nothing left to defend. Her name had been separated from her, her place in society erased with the same precision that had defined the case itself. And in its place, there was only what remained after proof. Edward did not follow her. He did not watch her leave, because for him, the matter had already been concluded. What no longer belonged did not require attention. The story, however, did not end at the court. It moved outward, through conversations, through quiet references, through the kind of retelling that removes detail and keeps only what matters. A man had proven that the child was not his, and in doing so, he had done something few dared to attempt. He had turned suspicion into certainty. Margaret became part of that certainty, not as a person, as an example. And examples once established are not questioned. They are remembered. Years passed, but the case did not disappear. It remained, not as a daily conversation, not as something spoken openly in every room, but as a reference point that surfaced whenever the subject of reputation, marriage, or inheritance arose. People did not need to remember every detail to understand its meaning. They remembered enough. Edward Robinson continued his life without visible disruption, his routine intact, his position in society not only preserved but quietly reinforced. He had done something that many suspected could be done, yet few were willing to attempt. He had proven, not with emotion, not with accusation, with structure. And in doing so, he had aligned himself with something society trusted more than sentiment: certainty. He did not speak about the case. There was no need, because silence, when supported by proof, carries its own authority. Margaret's life moved in the opposite direction, though not in a way that drew attention. There was no dramatic fall, no public display that could be observed and discussed. Instead, her world became smaller, more contained, shaped by absence rather than event. Fewer invitations, fewer conversations, fewer doors that opened without question. The change was not announced, it was understood. She existed within that understanding, adapting not by choice but by necessity, her identity no longer defined by who she had been, but by what had been concluded about her. The boy grew, slowly, quietly, without awareness of the exact moment his life had been decided, because that moment had occurred before memory, before language, before the ability to ask the question that would eventually define him. By the time he began to notice the differences, they were already part of the structure of his world. A name that did not open doors, a presence that required explanation, a silence that followed certain questions. He learned not to ask too often, because some answers did not come. And over time, unanswered questions lose their voice and become something else entirely: identity. Edward never acknowledged him again, not in private reflection and not in public reference. Once the conclusion had been reached, the connection had been removed with the same precision that had defined every step of the case. What did not belong was no longer considered, completely. Margaret, living away from the life she had once known, carried something different. Not the details of the case, not the arguments or the evidence, but the weight of its result. Because truth, as she had experienced it, no longer mattered. Only what could be proven had remained. The Robinson case endured because it represented something more than scandal. It demonstrated how law, medicine, and logic could converge to create a conclusion that would not change, regardless of what existed beyond it. Time had defined the limits. Biology had supported the structure. The court had made it permanent. Years later, when the specifics had faded and the names were less frequently spoken, the essence of the case remained intact. It was repeated in fragments, simplified into a form that could be understood without context. A child had lost everything, not because of action, because of proof. And that was what stayed. Because proof does not ask who someone is. It decides what they are allowed to be. In the end, no one remembered the letters. No one remembered the exact dates. No one even remembered the name of the man who might have been the father. But they remembered the result. A child who grew up without the name he was born into, because one man proved he had never had the right to carry it.